The Bravo clubhouse had never looked sharper. Rows of neon lights shimmered against the bottles of gin and tequila lined like trophies along the back wall. A studio dressed for fun. That was Andy Cohen's signature. The music kicked in, that upbeat Bravo jingle that always promised more fun than fallout. The cameras swept across the set, catching the twinkling skyline backdrop and the glimmer of the Martini Glass logo spinning on the screen. Andy turned toward the audience, his smile practiced, his tone perfect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "she's been on magazine covers, in palaces, and at the center of more headlines than we can count. Tonight, she's here at Bravo. Please welcome the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle." The applause that followed was polite but not deafening. It wasn't the wild, shrieking welcome of an adored celebrity. It was the careful applause of people unsure what they were about to witness. Then came the click of heels. Meghan Markle appeared from behind the curtain, dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and matching trousers. Minimal jewelry, polished hair, the posture of someone who'd rehearsed every frame of her walk. She exuded precision, not warmth. Control, not comfort. Her smile was immaculate, the same smile the cameras had seen in palaces, red carpets, and interviews across the Atlantic. And he extended his hand. "Meghan, welcome to Watch What Happens Live." "Thank you for having me," she said smoothly, her voice low, rehearsed, deliberate. "It's great to be here." The audience clapped again, and Meghan took her seat. She crossed her legs gracefully, adjusting the lapel of her blazer, a flicker of poise that said everything here is exactly as I planned. Andy sat opposite her, resting his drink on the desk. The cocktail, his trademark, glittered under the lights. He leaned back, smiling with a relaxed charm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So, Meghan," he began lightly, "California life treating you well?" Her smile widened, just a touch. "It's wonderful. We're building, creating, redefining what life can look like when you live authentically." Her tone was polished, but there was an undercurrent, a faint defensiveness, a subtle edge that clung to her words like static. "Redefining," Andy repeated. "I like that." He took a sip of his drink, eyes never leaving hers. "A lot of people say you've redefined what it means to be royal. Some call it inspiring. Others, well," he chuckled softly, "they call it rebellious." Meghan's gaze flickered for a second, a spark of amusement crossing her face. "People call it what they want," she said. "I call it living on my own terms." The audience laughed politely, though the energy felt a little too tight, a little too restrained. Andy caught it. The air was already changing. "Right," he said, tapping his cards. "Let's talk about those terms." The first few minutes of Watch What Happens Live are usually fluff, pop culture, a fun game, maybe a viral TikTok question. But tonight, Andy wasn't here to play. He was here to test the Duchess, who had mastered controlling every narrative she touched. And Meghan could feel it. Her smile held, but her posture straightened just slightly, the instinctive armor of someone who senses the first signs of confrontation. Andy's questions began innocently enough. "You and Harry, how's life in California? You two have really built something new out there." Her response was immediate. "We're doing incredible things. We've created a space where we can focus on meaningful work, philanthropy, storytelling, global impact." The words flowed like press copy, controlled, smooth, and utterly safe. Andy nodded slowly, sipping his drink again. "That's great. You've certainly been busy. Podcasts, documentaries, books. Some might say you're more visible now than when you were in the royal family." Meghan's laugh was quick, but not warm. "Visibility isn't the same as exposure. This time, it's on my terms." "Right," Andy said, setting his drink down. "Your terms." He paused. "And how's that working out?" It was the faintest provocation, small enough to sound like curiosity, sharp enough to draw blood. Meghan's smile froze, just for a heartbeat. "It's working beautifully," she said finally. "We're exactly where we're meant to be." But her eyes betrayed a flicker, something quick and unguarded, gone as soon as it appeared. Andy saw it. He didn't pounce, not yet. Instead, He leaned back in his chair and chuckled softly. Good to hear. You know, Meghan, you might be one of the few guests who's had Buckingham Palace and Bravo Studios on their resume. That's quite a contrast. Meghan smiled again, perfectly composed. Well, both involve performance and production, she quipped lightly. Just different audiences. The crowd laughed, but it wasn't the warm laughter of connection. It was laughter edged with discomfort, the kind that follows a statement everyone knows has a sharper truth underneath. Andy's grin widened just slightly. Oh, I like that. So would you say royal life was performative? Her tone shifted, still polite, but laced with quiet irritation. I'd say it's a system. And like any system, it thrives on control. Let's just say I prefer authenticity to choreography. Andy nodded slowly, pretending to jot something down, though he wasn't writing anything. Authenticity over choreography, he repeated. That's a good line. But some might say your new life, the cameras, the deals, the interviews, still involve a lot of choreography. Meghan's posture stiffened, though her expression didn't change. Control isn't choreography, she said sharply. It's agency. There's a difference. The audience murmured. Andy smiled, the kind of smile that said he'd found the pressure point. Well, he said, raising his glass slightly. Here's to agency, then. She clinked her glass against his, her smile returning. And to doing things our way, she replied. But even as she spoke, the faintest hint of tension had settled between them, a subtle chill beneath the lights. From the outside, it still looked like a polite conversation, two professionals trading words over cocktails. But those who knew how to read a room could already see the storm gathering. For Meghan Markle, this was supposed to be another controlled appearance, a carefully managed moment to reshape her image. But for Andy Cohen, it was something else entirely. He wasn't playing her game. He was rewriting the rules. And as the red light on the camera blinked, the stage was set for one of the most combustible interviews Bravo had ever aired. The Duchess had entered the clubhouse to talk about reinvention. She didn't yet know she'd leave as the headline. The applause faded as the next segment began, but the warmth in the room had already thinned to a fragile thread. The Bravo studio, known for its cozy chaos and quick laughter, now felt unnervingly formal. The energy of a cocktail party where one guest was smiling too hard and another had already spotted the crack in the glass. Andy Cohen leaned back in his chair, swirling the ice in his drink as though to fill the silence that hovered between them. He had spent years perfecting this posture, part charm, part challenge. When Andy went quiet, it wasn't because he'd run out of questions. It was because he was waiting for the right one. So, he said at last, voice casual but eyes sharp. You mentioned authenticity earlier. That word's followed you for years, in interviews, documentaries, podcasts. Do you ever worry people don't buy it anymore? It was a question that sounded harmless to the untrained ear. But to Meghan, it was the first crack of lightning. Her head tilted slightly, her lips tightening before forming a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. If people doubt authenticity, she replied softly, that says more about them than me. Andy's smirk returned, faint but deliberate. Or maybe it says the message is getting lost in translation. The audience gave a small, nervous chuckle. Meghan's smile remained frozen, but the corners trembled, just barely. Andy continued, flipping a cue card. You've built this incredible platform since stepping away from the royal family. Global visibility, creative freedom, multimillion-dollar deals. And yet, you've often said you were silenced. That's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it? Meghan shifted slightly in her seat, her posture tightening. There's a difference between speaking freely and being heard, she said carefully. When I said I felt silenced, I meant within an institution, not by the public. Andy nodded slowly. Of course. But now you're one of the most amplified voices in the world. Some might say you've gone from being silenced to dominating the conversation. The words landed like a soft jab, hidden behind a smile. Meghan's eyes flickered, a momentary flash of irritation. Dominating, she repeated, her voice edged. No, I'm participating. I'm using the platform I earned to tell stories that matter. Andy leaned in slightly, elbows resting on the desk. Fair enough. But some would say the stories that seem to matter most are your own. The studio went still. The faint hum of the cameras felt louder now. Meghan's smile broke for the briefest second, then returned, tighter. You're suggesting what? Exactly. And he kept his tone even. That maybe the public's fascination isn't just about your message, but about your contradictions. You talk about privacy, but you live in front of cameras. You talk about pain, but profit from telling it. You say you've moved on, but keep revisiting the past. There it was, the spark. Small, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. The Duchess of Sussex sat perfectly still. Every instinct told her not to react, not to give him what he wanted. But her pulse had quickened, and for a moment, the calm mask she'd built began to crack. I don't think, she said slowly, it's contradictory to speak truth while protecting my peace. The two can coexist. Andy tilted his head, pretending to consider it. They can, he agreed. But one tends to make better headlines than the other. A faint ripple of laughter moved through the audience, hesitant, uncomfortable. Meghan glanced toward them briefly, the faintest hint of disbelief in her eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe this crowd was laughing at her instead of with her. Andy didn't give her time to recover. Let's shift gears for a second, he said, tapping the cards in his hand. You mentioned truth. That's a word that seems to mean different things to different people these days. When you said in your Oprah interview that you and Harry were married privately before the public wedding, the Archbishop later said it wasn't legally binding. Do you regret phrasing it that way? The tension in the room sharpened instantly. Meghan's jaw tightened. That was a private spiritual exchange, she said, her tone clipped. It was about our commitment, not legality. People love to twist things out of context. And he gave a slow, knowing nod. Maybe. But when millions of people hear the Duchess of Sussex say she was married before the royal ceremony, that's a pretty big statement to misinterpret. Her eyes narrowed. I didn't misinterpret anything. I spoke from my heart. And the Archbishop spoke from the law, Andy replied gently. Two truths. Just different realities. The air was cold now. Meghan shifted in her seat again, clasping her hands to steady them. You're doing what journalists always do, she said, voice low but sharp. You take one sentence, twist it, and build an entire narrative around it. I see the game. Andy smiled faintly. Oh, Meghan, he said smoothly. I invented the game. The audience gasped softly. Meghan's expression froze, calm, composed, but her knuckles whitened on the armrest. Andy let the silence linger before softening his tone. Look, I get it. You've lived through scrutiny most people can't imagine. But you have to see how it looks from the outside, right? You walk away from an institution for privacy, then release documentaries, podcasts, and memoirs about that institution. Can you blame people for being confused? Meghan inhaled sharply, her shoulders rising, then forced a smile. I don't owe clarity to people who've never experienced what I lived through. Andy raised his glass slightly. That's fair, he said, but it's also convenient. The audience reacted, a faint collective gasp mixed with a ripple of awkward laughter. For the first time, Meghan's smile dropped completely. Her voice, when she spoke again, was quieter but colder. You know, Andy, she said, there's a difference between asking tough questions and trying to provoke someone. Which one are you doing? Andy set his glass down, leaning forward, elbows on the desk. His tone softened, but his eyes never did. That depends, he said. Which one are you answering? The silence that followed was deafening. For a brief second, the cameras caught Meghan's reflection in the desk, poised, perfect, and under siege. Andy didn't move. Neither did she. The audience seemed to hold their breath. It was still early in the show, but the balance had already shifted. The host who usually played the entertainer was now the interrogator, and the guest who came to charm the crowd was suddenly on defense. When the commercial break finally hit, the applause light blinked weakly, and a handful of uneasy claps filled the air. The Bravo set shimmered with the same soft colors, but something had changed. Behind her poised exterior, Meghan's thoughts raced, replaying every word, every pause, every smirk that Andy had thrown her way. She had faced world leaders, royal courtiers, and the most ruthless tabloids on earth. Yet here, under the lights of a talk show meant for gossip and games, she felt cornered. And Andy knew it. As the countdown began for the next segment, he leaned back, fixing his cuffs, and smiled slightly to himself. The spark had caught, and soon the fire would spread. The cameras blinked red again, the music faded, and the studio lights returned. Warm, golden, almost deceptive. Everything about Watch What Happens Live looked the same as it always did. The shimmering bar backdrop, the soft laughter from the audience, the playful cue cards stacked neatly in Andy's hands. But beneath the polish, the air had turned thick. Heavy. Electric. Meghan Markle sat perfectly still, her expression reset, her blazer smooth, her composure restored, or at least reconstructed. The Duchess had always been good at this part. She could reassemble herself faster than most people could blink. But Andy Cohen could see what others couldn't. The tension in her jaw, the subtle flex of her fingers against the armrest. She was smiling, yes, but she was ready. "Welcome back," Andy said with his trademark grin. "We're here with Meghan Markle, Duchess, actress, activist, and self-described storyteller." He emphasized the last word just enough to make it sound like a challenge. "We were just talking about authenticity, and I think it's safe to say this is one of our more honest conversations." A light ripple of laughter followed. Meghan returned the smile, though it felt brittle around the edges. "Yes," she said smoothly. "Honesty is important, even when people don't want to hear it." "Couldn't agree more," Andy said, tapping his cards lightly. "So let's be honest, then." That tone, polite, steady, but coldly precise, was the signal. The warmth was gone. The next few minutes would define the night. Andy leaned forward slightly, the studio lights catching the rim of his glass. "You've spoken often about the British press," he began, "how their coverage impacted your mental health, your family, your safety. Fair. But your critics say you've taken that pain and turned it into profit. Deals with Netflix, Spotify, books, documentaries. What do you say to those who believe you've built a brand around victimhood?" The audience shifted. You could hear the faint creak of someone crossing their legs. The words brand and victimhood hung in the air like barbed wire. Meghan's smile didn't falter, not yet, but the muscles around her eyes tightened. "I think," she said slowly, "it's sad when people trivialize healing. When a woman tries to speak her truth and she's accused of monetising it, it says more about the cynicism of the world than it does about her intentions." Andy nodded slightly, letting her finish, but there was no softness in his reply. "But it's not just speaking, is it?" he said. "It's producing, selling, marketing. You've built an entire media identity around the story of leaving the royal family. Can you see why some might call that convenient?" Her lips parted. For a moment, she looked genuinely taken aback. "Convenient," she echoed, her voice sharper now. "Andy, I think the trauma I lived through wasn't convenient for anyone, least of all me." He didn't interrupt. He just watched. That unnerved her more than any argument could have. "I had every right to reclaim my narrative," she continued, her tone rising slightly. "Every person who's been silenced deserves that. You don't get to decide how I heal, or when." "I'm not deciding anything," Andy said calmly. "I'm just asking what everyone else is thinking. Where's the line between sharing your story and selling it?" That line, that single question, was where the mask cracked. Meghan inhaled sharply, her posture rigid. The air around her seemed to vibrate with controlled fury. "That's a deeply sexist thing to imply," she said coldly. "Men build empires off their stories all the time. But when a woman does it, she's suddenly an opportunist. Interesting, isn't it?" Andy tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "But those men usually admit when they are building an empire." The audience murmured, caught between shock and fascination. Meghan shifted again, her composure starting to wobble. "What I'm building," she said, "is a platform for others, for people who don't have a voice. If that makes me a target, so be it." "Maybe," Andy said, voice low, "it makes you untouchable." The words landed like a slap. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the sound technicians at the back of the room froze mid-motion. Meghan blinked once, slowly. Her eyes flashed, her smile vanished. "Untouchable," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Andy. I'm just not afraid to call out hypocrisy when I see it." Andy leaned forward now, elbows on the desk, the smile gone from his face. "Then let's call it out," he said. "You say you want privacy, yet you've shared every chapter of your life on camera. You say you left the royal family to escape the spotlight, yet you've built an empire on keeping it pointed directly at you. You claim freedom, but every move you make circles back to the institution you say oppressed you. Why are you free? Why are you still feeding off the thing you left behind?" The audience gasped. The words were surgical, calm, factual, lethal. Meghan's breathing changed. For the first time, she didn't answer immediately. Her eyes darted briefly to the audience, not for support, but to gauge reaction. What she saw unsettled her. People weren't nodding. They were listening, watching, measuring. Her voice, when it came, trembled slightly with restrained anger. "You really think it's that simple?" she asked. "You think you can reduce my entire life to a soundbite? I fought for my family, my marriage, my sanity. And if telling that story helps someone else survive theirs, then I'll tell it as many times as I need to." Andy nodded slowly. "So it's about helping others. It's about truth," she snapped. He smiled faintly. "Yours or the truth?" Her expression froze. The air pressure seemed to drop. For a moment, no one moved. The Bravo set, so often filled with laughter and noise, was silent enough to hear the buzz of the stage lights. Meghan's shoulders squared, her chin lifted, but the vulnerability in her eyes betrayed her calm. "I don't need to justify my truth to you," she said finally. "I didn't ask you to," Andy replied, voice steady. "You came here to share it. I'm just making sure it holds up." She laughed then, short, humorless, sharp. "You enjoying this, aren't you?" she said, playing the provocateur, pretending you're uncovering something real. "But this isn't journalism, Andy. This is entertainment. And that's what you do best, entertain people by tearing someone else down." Andy didn't flinch. "You're right," he said softly. "It is entertainment. And you agreed to come on a show called Watch What Happens Live. And right now, everyone's watching what happens live." The audience murmured again. A low ripple, a mix of discomfort and awe. Meghan exhaled slowly, visibly struggling to maintain control. "You think this makes you brave?" she said. "You think holding me hostage under bright lights and twisting my words makes you the truth teller here? You're just like every other man who's tried to make me the villain in his narrative." Andy's eyes softened, but his voice didn't. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'm just the first person who didn't let you write both sides of the story." A hush fell. For a long, unbearable moment, they just stared at each other. Two professionals, two storytellers, two people who had mastered performance, until one of them started to lose control of the script. The director signaled for a commercial, but Andy ignored it. "One more question," he said. Meghan didn't answer. "You've spoken about the toll of being misunderstood," Andy continued. "About the cruelty of headlines, the strain of public life. But after everything, after the palace, the interviews, the books, do you ever look back and wonder if maybe, just maybe, some of the chaos followed you because you created it?" The audience inhaled sharply. Meghan's hand tightened around her microphone. Her expression was unreadable now, part fury, part disbelief, part wounded pride. "That's disgusting," she whispered. Andy didn't move. "You don't know what I went through," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't know the nights I cried, the isolation, the fear. You sit here with your drink and your cue cards, acting like this is clever. It's cruel." He didn't smile. He didn't blink. "It's honest." The cameras caught the moment perfectly, the exact second the power shifted. Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, once one of the most controlled public figures in the world, sat speechless on live television. And Andy Cohen, a man known for chaos, not confrontation, had just turned the Bravo set into a courtroom of public accountability. When the commercial finally rolled, the studio erupted, not in applause, but in whispers. Meghan leaned back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her jaw clenched. Andy stared straight ahead, his drink untouched. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning, and the storm had only just begun. The red light on the Bravo camera blinked again. A tiny dot, almost invisible under the glare of the studio lights. Yet somehow, everyone could feel it. That light meant the world was still watching. Every breath, every flinch, every tremor of emotion was being recorded and broadcast to millions. The set, normally buzzing with chatter and laughter, felt frozen in time. The air was sharp, cold even, the kind of silence that makes people lower their voices without realizing it. Meghan Markle sat stiffly in her chair, the image of composure, or what was left of it. Her posture was impeccable, her shoulders back, her chin high. But her eyes told another story. Beneath the practiced calm, a storm was raging. Across from her, Andy Cohen remained seated, legs crossed casually, hands resting on his cue cards. He didn't need to look at them anymore. Every question he'd planned had already burned through the polite facade of the night. The show was no longer following a script. It was pure instinct now. Truth versus control, ego versus endurance. When the commercial break ended, the audience applauded softly, unsure what to do. The producer's voice echoed faintly through the control room glass. "Keep it light, Andy. Ease her back in." But Andy wasn't going to ease anything. Not tonight. "Welcome back," he said with his trademark grin, though there was no humor behind it. "We're here with Meghan Markle, and I think it's fair to say, this has been one of the most candid conversations we've ever had on this show." There were a few cautious chuckles from the crowd. Meghan didn't laugh. She simply nodded, her smile tight, brittle, the kind of smile you wear when you're already halfway to the door. Andy swirled the ice in his glass again. "You know," he said lightly, "a lot of people come on this show to have fun, to relax, to show the side of themselves the public doesn't usually get to see. Do you think that's possible for you anymore?" It was a deceptively simple question, but everyone in the room knew it wasn't about the show. Meghan tilted her head slightly. "I think people see what they want to see," she said. "The media has done a brilliant job of building a version of me that fits their narrative. I can't control that. All I can do is be myself." Andy nodded slowly. "Right. The version they've built and the version you're selling." There it was, the spark that would set the room on fire. Meghan's head turned sharply toward him. "Excuse me." Andy didn't flinch. "You talk about control, image, narrative, but you're also one of the most media-savvy figures in the world. Some would say you don't just understand the game. You play it better than anyone." The audience murmured softly. Meghan's lips parted, then pressed together again. "I'm not playing a game, Andy," she said, her voice low but tight. "I'm surviving one." Andy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But survival implies threat. Who's threatening you now? The royal family, the press, or maybe the truth?" That word again, truth. It hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Meghan's jaw tightened. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair, knuckles whitening. "You love that word, don't you?" she said. "Truth. As if you own it. As if your version is the only one that matters." Andy smiled faintly. "No, Meghan. I just happen to know when someone's hiding behind it." The audience gasped. The temperature in the room dropped another few degrees. Even the crew, hardened Bravo veterans, sat motionless behind the cameras. Meghan's breathing quickened. The calm mask was cracking, the tension visible now in the corners of her eyes, the subtle twitch of her lip. "You think you can sit there and judge me," she said, her voice trembling with fury she could no longer suppress. "You have no idea what I've been through." "None. I'm not judging you," Andy said evenly. "I'm just asking what everyone else is afraid to." Meghan laughed then, short, bitter, cutting. "Afraid? Please. You're not brave, Andy. You're a host who thrives on conflict because it gets you clicks. You don't care about truth. You care about ratings." Andy's tone didn't change. "Maybe, but at least I admit it." The audience stirred, a faint gasp followed by uneasy laughter. Meghan blinked, stunned that he'd said it out loud. Andy leaned back in his chair again, calm as ever. You see, Meghan, that's the difference between us. I know what this is, television. You treat it like confession. Her face flushed. That's enough, she said coldly. You don't get to talk to me like that. I just did, Andy said softly. The silence that followed was thunderous. Even the hum of the lights seemed to stop. Meghan's eyes flashed, and for a split second, the polished Duchess was gone. What replaced her was raw, human, and furious. You think you're clever, she hissed. You think you can ambush me on live television and call it honesty? You're no better than the tabloids. Andy didn't blink. Then why keep giving the material? That did it. Meghan stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor with a piercing screech that sliced through the silence. The audience jumped. The camera caught every second, her hand reaching up to unclip her microphone. Her jaw clenched, her eyes wet but blazing with defiance. I don't have to take this, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. This was supposed to be a conversation, not an interrogation. Andy didn't move. It was a conversation, he said quietly, until you ran out of answers. Her expression twisted, disbelief, anger, humiliation, all colliding at once. You're unbelievable, she whispered. Andy set his cards down, his voice steady but cold. No, Meghan, I'm just not intimidated. The audience erupted, half in shock, half in stunned admiration. Meghan's face flushed red. You'll regret this, she said, barely above a whisper. Andy's expression didn't change. Maybe, he said, but at least I won't regret telling the truth. She stared at him for one final second, then turned sharply, tossing her mic onto the chair. The metallic thud echoed across the studio. Her heels clicked furiously against the floor as she strode off stage, shoulders rigid, the set lights reflecting off her perfectly tailored blazer. The cameras followed her until she disappeared behind the curtain. The audience sat frozen, no one clapping, no one breathing. Even the band didn't play. For a long, unbearable moment, Andy just sat there, his drink untouched, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he exhaled, straightened his jacket, and looked directly into the camera. Well, he said finally, the faintest hint of a smirk returning. I guess that answers the question of whether she can handle tough conversations. A nervous wave of laughter rippled through the audience, unsure if they were allowed to react. Andy nodded once, crisp and professional, and said, "We'll be right back." The red light on the camera blinked off. The studio exploded into chaos. Producers rushed toward the stage. Assistants whispered frantically into headsets. Someone from Meghan's team stormed past the crew, eyes wide with fury. "We're done here," she snapped. "That footage better not air." Andy stayed seated, watching the commotion unfold around him. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Only when the stage manager finally approached did he glance up. "You okay?" the manager asked. Andy gave a small, humorless smile. "Define okay." He reached for his drink, swirled it once, then set it down again. "Run the clip," he said quietly. "Which one?" He looked up, his eyes glinting under the lights. "The walkout." What the cameras didn't capture, at least not for broadcast, was what happened next. The studio doors swung open, and Meghan's voice could be heard echoing faintly down the hallway. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, disbelief, something bordering on panic. Her team followed her, one assistant carrying her bag, another clutching a phone to their ear. "Damage control," one whispered. "Now!" Outside, flashes from waiting paparazzi lit up the night. Someone had already leaked it. Inside, Andy remained on set, staring at the empty chair across from him. For years, Watch What Happens Live had been the place where celebrities came to unwind, to laugh, to play the game. Tonight, it became something else, a mirror held up to the most media-trained woman in the world. And for the first time in years, she couldn't control the reflection. The Duchess had stormed out, and the world was already watching. The footage would go viral within hours. The hashtags were already forming. But in the studio, amid the chaos, Andy just sat back in his chair and muttered under his breath, half amusement, half exhaustion. "Well," he said softly, "that happened." He lifted his glass, took one long sip, and set it down again. The ice had melted. The room was still, and the Bravo set, usually echoing with laughter, felt like the aftermath of a storm no one saw coming, except him. By dawn the next morning, the world had already chosen sides. What began as a fiery late-night segment on Watch What Happens Live had exploded into a cultural earthquake. Every screen, every social feed, every headline pulsed with one name: Meghan Markle. Clips from the broadcast flooded the internet within minutes. The moment she stood up, the sound of a microphone clattering against the chair. The way Andy Cohen didn't flinch, didn't move, just stayed calmly as she stormed off stage. It was television gold, and a PR disaster. For Meghan, the fallout was immediate. Her team had gone into overdrive before the credits had even finished rolling. The Duchess's spokesperson released a statement before sunrise, polished, carefully worded, and loaded with subtle blame. The interview on Bravo took a tone that was unexpectedly aggressive and disrespectful. Meghan has always welcomed honest dialogue, but personal attacks under the guise of journalism are unacceptable. The message was clear. She was the wronged one, again. But online, things weren't so simple. #Meghan storms off trended across social media. Millions of viewers dissected every frame, every gesture, every line of dialogue. Some hailed her as a woman finally standing up to yet another man trying to control her narrative. Others accused her of hypocrisy, of proving everything her critics had said all along, that she could dish out the drama but couldn't take accountability. Clips of Andy's final line, "Until you ran out of answers," spread like wildfire. It was replayed on talk shows, reaction channels, late-night comedy sketches. Memes flooded the internet. A frozen still of Meghan mid-exit captioned, "When accountability enters the chat." Meanwhile, Bravo executives sat in their Manhattan office watching the ratings spike in real time. The overnight numbers shattered records, the most-watched Watch What Happens Live episode in the network's history. Sponsors were already calling. The segment was controversial, sure, but controversy was currency. For Andy, it was the quiet after the storm. He'd gone home around midnight, ignoring the dozens of calls flooding his phone, from network heads, publicists, even friends warning him that he'd gone too far. But sitting on his terrace with a glass of wine and the city lights flickering below, he didn't feel guilt, just exhaustion. He'd interviewed hundreds of stars, navigated egos, scandals, and spin. But never had someone tried to control the stage quite like Meghan Markle. And never had someone lost control of it so completely. By morning, the tabloids had declared it the meltdown heard around the world. The Daily Mail headline read, "Meghan loses her cool. Duchess walks out on Andy Cohen after brutal exchange." Across the Atlantic, The Guardian took a different tone. "Cohen crosses the line. Why Meghan's walkout reflects a media culture obsessed with female anger." On cable news, the talking heads feasted. CNN debated whether Andy Cohen had violated journalistic ethics. Fox called it a masterclass in accountability. And on Good Morning Britain, a familiar face, Piers Morgan, couldn't resist twisting the knife. "You can leave the palace. You can leave the country," he smirked on air. "But apparently, you can't leave the drama." Within hours, the segment had been replayed over 20 million times. Reaction videos flooded YouTube. Hashtags multiplied. #Team Andy, #Team Meghan, #Truth or PR. Every influencer, every gossip columnist, every royal commentator had a take. But perhaps the most viral moment came not from Meghan's exit, but from the still frame of Andy Cohen sitting perfectly still in her absence, his cocktail glass glinting under the lights. That image, calm amid chaos, became symbolic. The host, who was usually accused of stirring drama, had become the one standing still while a duchess unraveled. At Bravo headquarters, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. One executive slapped a printout of the trending chart onto the table. "We're #1 worldwide," she said breathlessly. "We beat The Tonight Show, Fallon, Colbert, everyone." Andy didn't smile. "Yeah," he said dryly. "But at what cost?" He knew what would come next. The think pieces, the outrage, the celebrity statements. Hollywood thrived on polarization, and Meghan had mastered that game long before he'd ever sat across from her. That afternoon, a new post appeared on her official website, an open letter written in the familiar voice her followers knew well. For years, I've been told to stay silent. I've been mocked, doubted, ridiculed, and yet, I keep showing up. Last night, I stood my ground against another man trying to twist my truth into entertainment. I will never apologize for defending my voice. It was powerful, emotional, perfectly timed. Within minutes, it had 2 million likes. But for every word of support, there were 10 comments calling her out. You weren't silenced, one wrote. You were questioned. By evening, late-night hosts had joined in. Jimmy Kimmel joked, Meghan Markle stormed off Andy Cohen's set last night. Guess she didn't get the royal treatment. Even Saturday Night Live teased a parody sketch promo before the week was over. And through it all, Andy stayed quiet. He didn't tweet. He didn't post. He didn't defend himself. When asked by a reporter outside the Bravo building if he had anything to say to Meghan, he simply replied, I think the interview speaks for itself. But privately, behind closed doors, Andy knew the moment was bigger than either of them. It wasn't just about a duchess losing her temper or a host pushing too far. It was about something deeper, the collapsing line between truth and theater, between authenticity and performance. Both of them had mastered the art of controlling a narrative. Both had lived under scrutiny, thrived on visibility. And yet, under those lights, only one walked away untouchable. By midnight, the Bravo clip hit 50 million views. The comments poured in faster than anyone could moderate. The world wasn't just watching anymore. It was dissecting, dividing, choosing sides again. And somewhere in Montecito, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, Meghan watched too. The glow of her laptop reflected in her eyes as she scrolled through the coverage. Anger, sadness, defiance. They all flickered across her face. Then, slowly, she closed the screen and whispered under her breath, they'll never get the last word. But across the country, in a quiet New York apartment, Andy Cohen poured himself another drink, glanced at the still image trending on every platform, her empty chair, and smiled faintly. They already did, he murmured. Weeks had passed since that night on Watch What Happens Live, but its echoes hadn't faded. They lingered, in headlines, in podcasts, in dinner table debates. The clip had gone from viral moment to cultural artifact. Every few days, another headline revived it. The interview that changed everything. Meghan versus Andy, when the cameras wouldn't blink. The night the Duchess lost her cool. What had started as a simple talk show segment had mutated into a national mirror, reflecting not just one woman's pride or one man's persistence, but the way modern fame itself was being rewritten. In London, tabloids dissected her every word like ancient scripture. In America, think pieces flooded digital columns. One called it the undoing of the untouchable, another dubbed it a lesson in PR hubris. And yet, just as many defended her, feminist writers argued that Andy Cohen had embodied the system that had always cornered women in media. Others saw something far less symbolic, a guest who expected control and cracked when she lost it. Either way, it had become clear. This was no longer about Meghan Markle or Andy Cohen. It was about the cost of narrative warfare. Inside Bravo headquarters, the walls still buzzed with the aftershock. Ratings had exploded. Advertisers were thrilled. The clip had reached hundreds of millions of views globally, more than any episode in network history. And yet, behind the applause, there was unease. Andy had turned down multiple interview requests since the taping. CNN, the New York Times, even Oprah's team had reached out for follow-ups. He declined them all. When asked by one Bravo executive if he wanted to clarify his side, he had only replied, "Why?" The footage already did. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was quiet. Because something about that night had shifted the ground beneath him too. For years, he'd built his empire on chaos, on confrontation disguised as fun, on awkward moments that made audiences laugh. But what happened with Meghan wasn't funny. It wasn't designed for entertainment. It was real, uncomfortably real. And that's what made it unforgettable. In a private moment, Andy told a friend, "I didn't plan it to go that way." But she came in expecting worship, not questions. Once you strip away the PR armor, you see the truth. She's not used to being challenged. He took another sip of his drink, then added, "But I'll say this, she's brilliant at the aftermath. No one spins faster." Meanwhile, in Montecito, Meghan was doing exactly that. Her PR team had crafted a full-blown redemption campaign, carefully timed public appearances, emotional interviews, a glossy photo shoot for Vogue titled Unbroken. In it, she described the Bravo interview as an ambush dressed as entertainment. "I walked into a trap," she said, her tone calm but wounded. "I should have known better, but I'll never let anyone silence my truth again." The article was sympathetic, beautifully photographed, immaculately edited. It worked, for a while. But then came the comment section. Then came the satire. By the time late-night hosts parroted her truth quote for the 100th time, the message had changed. The public wasn't seeing courage anymore. They were seeing performance. And for someone who had built her empire on authenticity, that was fatal. Months later, when Bravo quietly re-released the episode as part of its Greatest Moments compilation, it was streamed more than any reunion, any reality scandal, any celebrity meltdown in the network's archive. The numbers were staggering, but what mattered more was how people talked about it now. It wasn't just gossip. It was studied, analyzed, taught in media studies courses about power, perception, and public persona. In one viral YouTube essay, a cultural critic broke it down frame by frame. At exactly 43 minutes in, Meghan loses control, not because Andy attacks her, but because he doesn't bend. That's what she's used to. The moment he refuses to be charmed, the dynamite collapses. That analysis got millions of views, because people weren't just watching the clash anymore, they were watching what it revealed. The idea that image could fracture on camera, that even the most rehearsed persona could crack under the pressure of unfiltered accountability. Meanwhile, Andy Cohen's own image began to shift too. He was no longer seen as just the mischievous host who orchestrated Bravo's chaos. Overnight, he became something else, the unintentional symbol of backbone in a culture addicted to politeness. People began calling him the man who didn't flinch. At award shows, celebrities made jokes about pulling a Meghan. Publicists added clauses to contracts ensuring final edit rights. Other hosts, Fallon, Colbert, even Kimmel, were asked in interviews if they would have dared to ask those questions. Each of them dodged. And yet, despite the explosion, Andy stayed measured. No follow-ups, no shade, no victory lap. In one rare interview months later, he summed it up in a single line. It wasn't about winning. It was about not pretending. But for Meghan, the legacy cut deeper. Her next project, a docuseries centered on women's empowerment, struggled to find a distributor. Sponsors hesitated. Streaming platforms grew cautious. Not because she wasn't famous, but because she was polarizing in a way that scared executives. She still had supporters, millions of them. But the media, once her amplifier, now treated her like volatile electricity. Every headline carried subtext. Every interview carried tension. Every appearance carried ghosts of that Bravo night. And yet, in her own mind, Meghan remained defiant. She wasn't broken. She was misunderstood, again. Her team leaned into that framing, crafting a new narrative of resilience. The word victim disappeared. It was replaced with visionary. But no matter how glossy the rebrand, the internet didn't forget. Every clip, every smirk, every line from that night still lived online, remixed, captioned, and analyzed endlessly. You could delete posts. You couldn't delete history. A year later, The Hollywood Reporter ran a feature titled The Interview That Redefined Celebrity Control. The piece didn't take sides. It didn't praise or condemn. It just observed. The Andy Cohen and Meghan Markle clash wasn't about cruelty or courage. It was about what happens when the curated image meets the unfiltered question. It showed us the limits of performance and the hunger of an audience that's tired of being lied to. That line stuck. It was printed on posters, quoted in essays, even referenced at the Emmys when Watch What Happens Live won a special award for Most Talked About Broadcast of the Year. When Andy walked up to accept it, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. He said only 5 words. Sometimes, silence says everything. Back in Montecito, Meghan watched the clip from her living room. The applause, the lights, the image of Andy holding the award. For a long moment, she just stared. Then she turned off the television. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet she used to crave, the kind she once called freedom. But now, it sounded different. Outside, the California evening glowed gold through the windows. She sat there, hands folded, the faint reflection of herself caught in the glass. The Duchess, the actress, the advocate, all of them looked back at her. And for a fleeting second, she whispered something no one else would ever hear. Maybe they saw too much. Then, with the practiced grace of someone who had rebuilt her image 1,000 times, she straightened her posture, adjusted the silk sleeve of her blouse, and looked away from the reflection. Because if there was one thing Meghan Markle knew how to do better than anyone else, it was to keep walking forward, even when the cameras didn't. And so, the legacy of that night lived on. Not as a scandal, not even as an interview, but as a story. A story about truth and performance. About ego and endurance. About what happens when two forces meet, one desperate to control the narrative, the other determined to expose it. It was entertainment. It was history. It was everything the modern world had become. And long after the lights of the Bravo set faded, one truth remained. Some interviews end, but some never stop echoing.